Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're here to talk about scaling teams within organizations. My name is James Richards. I'm the Executive Director of Corporate Development at TRINET. For those who don't know, TRINET is a publicly traded HR corporation based here in the Bay Area. We're the HR partner to over 13,000 small businesses in the United States, representing roughly about 330,000 employees. I'm joined here today by an incredible panel. Before I have them introduce themselves, just a quick note on format. I'm going to take my turns asking the panel a number of prepared questions. At about 10 minutes left to go, we'll have time for audience questions as well, if folks have them. If not, we'll just keep going with questions. So with that said, why don't we start with Steve and go down the line, and if you could each introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your experience, scaling organizations.
Okay, so Steve Cadigan, about 30-year HR professional, practiced in Canada, US, did M&A for many years with Cisco. I was running the HR acquisition integration team back in the 90s when times were good. Most recently, I was the Vice President of Talent at LinkedIn during some hyper-growth years. When I joined, we were about 6 years old at LinkedIn, 400 people. There was no one really in the HR organization besides a few recruiters. I was the first sort of professional HR person that they hired. And over the course of the next about 4 years that I was with LinkedIn, we grew to about 4,000 people, went through an IPO, and the stock popped from about $3 to about $175 during that period. And I think revenue went from about 20 million to 1.5 billion. So it was quite a crazy ride.
Very cool.
Cool. I'm Ernest. I lead HR strategy and people analytics and data science at SALESFORCE. I joined SALESFORCE when it was still a very large company at 7,000. We're at 30,000 now, so that's been quite an incredible journey. And all the while just trying to think about how do we keep SALESFORCE a great place to work.
Yeah, hi, Mihir, Shah. I'm the CEO of DROBO. DROBO is a little bit of a re-startup. It was a Silicon Valley darling back in 2005, 2006. I took over about 3 years ago and really put together a restructuring plan, and the business is starting to scale again. So I got some interesting scaling down stories as well as scaling up stories.
I have those scaling down stories too. My name's Sharifan. I lead the people operations team at a company called Slack. I was the first professional HR person there, and I joined when about 200 people, about 1,200 people today. That was almost 3 years ago. So definitely some hyper growth, and can talk about that if you'd like. And I've been doing this for about 17 years.
Great. So each of you have been part of some incredible growth trajectories at your companies. Starting with you, Dawn, and I guess going down the line, what's been the biggest challenge in going through that trajectory?
I don't know about you guys. It's been easy, right? It's like just show up. I think the hardest thing is to be true to what you're focused on, the culture you're trying to set, the intention. I think every HR person will tell you it's balancing urgent and important. And then when you grow at that hyper growth, we've been 3 different companies in 3 different years. So what you need at one stage is very different than what you need at the next stage. So while you're trying to build the track while the train is going down it, you're also trying to plan for 6, 12, 5 years from now, and getting today and scale, balancing those two things is very challenging.
Yeah, the most challenging thing for us at DROBO is when we took over, we actually had to scale down. And when you scale down, there's a relative kind of cultural demise, if you will. People aren't sure whether they're going to keep their jobs or not. And so to get that culture really turned around and get new people in, and as they're interviewing them, have that positivity to get new people in, that was a challenge. But it took about a good 3 to 6 months to get them to believe that, hey, here's the vision and we're going to go execute on it. So those were our challenges.
I think for us, it's definitely around scale and scaling, hiring thousands of people. A quarter was a great challenge, and one of the stories that we had is someone quit on the very first day because we knew that everybody was just through their own sheer Herculean effort trying to get all of these people hired on, and we weren't scaling, and we were just throwing bodies at the problem. And when you think about that, as you're going through hypergrowth, things are going to fall through the cracks, and people are going to get very discouraged and disengaged with that process. And those first impressions are always the lasting impressions. And so that's been the challenge of how do you figure out how do you scale as you're growing and you're bringing on people. That's been a big challenge.
Gosh, I could use the rest of the time talking about the problems we had at LinkedIn and the biggest challenges. I guess the two big ones I would call out were our entire leadership team at LinkedIn had never done anything like we were about to do. No one had ever been really in a startup before. Our CEO had never been a CEO before. Our CFO had never really taken a company public before. And so we were all rookies. And on paper, we never should have done what we ultimately realized we were doing. And so we had a lot of what I call big company refugees. We had the people from Yahoo that said, we're never going to do X, Y, Z from Yahoo. We had the Googlers that said, we're never going to impede internal movement like we felt at Google, and that's why we left Google. And so everyone knew a lot more about what they didn't want in building a company, and a lot of people didn't really know how to do it. So that was a big challenge, but it created a great focal point for us to really debate and to fight. And I remember the first day walking into staff meeting, like, okay, so should we have performance reviews? I'm like, what? You guys don't even know if you're going to have performance reviews? You're 6 years old, it's a company? Like, that's like heresy in HR circles. Like, no, we shouldn't do them. And then the guys from Google were like, yeah, we should. And we should have like a 6 decimal place performance rating. And then the Yahoo people were like, no, well, if we do it, we shouldn't tell the employees. And then the Adobe guys were like, no, we should tell the employees. Didn't you hear what happened at Microsoft? And so that was day one. And it went on and on and on. And so trying to sort of get a hold when you're growing like crazy, what's important? How are we going to do this? And I think the way through that was really a helpful argument and helpful discussion. But what we were really trying to do is figure out how are we going to build trust with our employees? Because we're going to go through some crazy stuff and we don't really know what we're doing. But we got to make some really tough decisions. So that was number one. Number two, I think, was the irony of LinkedIn was the biggest problem we had was also our biggest product, which was recruiting. We just couldn't hire. We couldn't hire fast enough. We were terrified that Google was going to take our business, that Facebook was going to wake up and call themselves Workbook. We were terrified that Salesforce was going to take Chatter and explode it out, and we wouldn't be as relevant anymore. So we couldn't hire fast enough, and that. We can tell more about that story as we share some of the challenges, but that was a pain point. Sitting in my office week after week, executives coming back, VP of engineering, hey, we were just at this job fair and no one's at our table. And I'm like, well, look what you're wearing. Why would anyone come to your table? Like, they're all at Facebook, they're all over here, they're all over that. And literally, we had hiring managers, I had to break up physical fights because I got that candidate first. No, they're on my team. And that was real. And so a lot of people think, oh, it was just a walk in the park. You guys, it was so easy. Oh, it was brutal.
That is a new challenge. I've never heard of having to break up fights between hiring managers as a challenge of hypergrowth. Well, why don't we start with recruiting then, because it's been kind of a common theme. Ernest, you highlighted scaling recruiting. And I think you mean that from a process and internal. So talk to us about that. How did you do that at Salesforce?
I think when it comes down to it, you have to have certain processes in place. You have to understand your ratios. You have to have good metrics in terms of how many people are going through the pipeline, how many people are you interviewing. Because, like you said, you can't get enough people in sometimes, and you just can't let hiring be that impediment to your growth. And so you just have to be really sure about your metrics and also the things that you're hiring for. I think, whether it's the competencies or culture fit, those things well defined from the very beginning so that you can hire against those things at scale and at speed.
Yeah, I mean, again, we have a different problem, right? When we first joined, it was a little bit of a turnaround situation. So we went through this zero-based budgeting exercise, which is we got all the leadership around the team, and we said, okay, we're only going to put in people that we know are going to generate an ROI. Everything else is going to go. And so, you had a organization that was so used to getting funding from, venture capitalists, private equity firms. It was like, at some point it's got to stop. The business had not turned a profit in 10 years, and you had to articulate, look, we're not in this is not a charity, right? And we're in the hardware business, right? Nobody's investing in hardware companies. They're investing in SaaS companies, right? And so to have that come to Jesus talk with a lot of the engineers, and I still remember this, the first night I was there, the lead engineer came to my office and said, hey, this organization used to be 35 engineers. And I'm like, well, you know what? You're going to be lucky if you're going to get 5 total. So it was just completely a different experience than you guys, right? And then every additional head was, okay, what is this person going to do, and what's the return on the work that they're going to provide? And if I don't see an ROI, we're not going to make that hire. So again, different experiences than you guys.
And I would say, we grew really, really quickly. We doubled in size every 6 months from the time that the company was founded. And we made an active decision to actually slow hiring because the drag on the organization in terms of onboarding people, the cultural impact when you're looking to somebody. I remember when I first started, someone looked at me and said, you can't say you're new after 2 weeks. And I thought, oh, crap, okay. And so you're learning your culture from someone who started the week before, practices privacy. You're not growing with intention. And so we actively made the decision to slow down our headcount and our growth so we could kind of get in front of it and digest. One of the analogies we use sometimes is the snake that ate the goat. So we needed some time to digest that before we decided to move forward with intention.
Yeah, I think, if you're recruiting today, especially here in the Valley, in the greater Bay Area, you got to ask yourself one question first. I know it's going to sound cliche, but we asked this question at one of those pivotal moments in our evolution at LinkedIn, which was after huge offer decline rates, and there isn't a software engineer here that doesn't have 5 offers at the same time. Why does someone want to work here? Why does someone really want to work for your company? And what are the attributes that you have? And if you say, we got A-list investors, we got a really cool product, we're going to have a bright future, we like people, we treat them really well, well, guess what? Everyone else has got that. Everyone else has got that. So what do you have that's unique? And we thought we were all on the same page as a leadership team until we had this crisis of confidence issue come up. And we finally realized, you know what? The one thing we have that Google, and we were in the shadows of Google trying to build LinkedIn, the one thing we have that they don't have is we're solving something that's really important, helping people find their dream jobs. They're not doing that next door. They're not doing that up at Twitter or Facebook. We're doing something really amazing. And so let's get the people, let's tell that story, and let's talk about the value of that problem that we're solving. But really was through pain and through failure that we finally realized, why does someone really want to work here? And what assets do we have? And we could never pay more. The first 3 years I was there, every single person took a pay cut. It was easy for me. You want to make more than $300,000? Great. My CEO doesn't make that. Yep. I can't do that. And if you want to go next door and make more money at Google, then you should go there, if that's really important to you. And when you start saying no, guess what? They start saying, well, wait a second, hang on. And so that's when things started to change for us. We started to realize, well, who are we? And it's okay that not everyone wants to work for us. Because I think, especially when you're young, you feel rejection feels like rejection of you, of your identity, of your product, of what you're doing. No, this is one of the most competitive job markets on the planet. That's okay. But if you think for a moment that some recruiters or a search firm or your talent partners at your venture capital investors are going to solve your problem, you're wrong. It's full contact sport. Everyone's got to be all in. Every staff meeting we had, every other week, the first thing we talked about was recruiting. Every time. The whole company. The most important thing. We've got to scale this thing or we're going to die.
Yeah, so, Steve, to add to that, we don't pay anywhere near the average of any of these companies over here. And our tenure, the company's only 10 years old. Our average employee has been around for 8 years. So if you think about that, they have not left. And so, we've built an organization really built on one thing, and that's transparency, right? Is from the leadership team, everybody has to know what's going on, whether it's good or bad. If you have a cash flow hit, we have this thing called Transparent Tuesdays. We get everybody around the horn, the people who are remote on the phone. You know what? It was a tough week. We didn't hit our revenue numbers. We're going to have to go back to our investors to get it. So then when you got to go do a riff or something like that, it doesn't come as a surprise. The last thing the employee base wants is this thing that just comes out of nowhere. But if you're upfront with them, here's the business performance, here's revenue, here's profit. Every Tuesday they know where we are. There's absolutely no surprise. And if we got to go do something, it's like, okay, we understand. But to tell you, we've kept people around 8 years. Our key engineers, the guy who wrote the code on the first DROBO, he's still there. 10 years he's been there and he hasn't left. So
that's insane.
I know. So, but again, it goes to your point. It's not about money. Right. It's about the executive leadership showing that vision and also being transparent about how the business is performing. At least that's what's helped us.
It's all about culture, right? It's all about the culture that you set up at the very beginning, because you can't think of culture as an afterthought when you're at $100 million, right? It starts at the very beginning. And so the same thing for Salesforce. Mark started the company with the culture that he wanted, and he was very intentional about that. from day one, and that's what scales, and that's what you take into the hypergrowth stage of your company, and you try and scale that, because that's the sort of, I would say, the heuristic that everybody works on, is that culture.
I want to jump in on that. We hear the word culture a lot. We've heard it a lot today. We're hearing it a lot now. I think it would be worthwhile to go down the line, starting with you, Dawn. How do you define and measure culture at Slack? And has that changed in your tenure there?
Yeah, I can answer that question, but there's a point I wanted to make to what you said, which I thought was really important, which is this Transparent Tuesday. I think people need to also talk about how hard it is to have Transparent Tuesday, and how as leaders we stand and be like, okay, we committed to do this thing, and we're going to have to deliver a difficult message. And I think that people are committed to the idea of transparency, and then you have to have a difficult conversation, and it's really easy to back away from it. So doing that and building a culture with intention takes a lot of bravery, and it takes a lot of commitment. And I don't think people talk about that enough. So congratulations to you on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I haven't had a pie thrown at my face.
Well, I think there's a couple of buzzwords in the Valley. I don't know if you guys would agree, but transparency, culture, diversity, what that means, right? I'm not saying those things or their ideas are buzzwords are not valuable, but how people define them and how people work through them are very, very different. And so every company says the word, but how do you live it, I think, is really important. And to really live it takes a lot of bravery.
And how do you define those things at Slack?
So, love that culture question. So I think for us at Slack, what we define culture is kind of the norms, the behaviors, the processes and procedures that result in an intentional way that we are growing and scaling our organization. And from an operational standpoint, we measure it by things like Culture Amp. We use that as a tool. We have an engagement score. We have some teams use an NPS score for different various offsites or trainings or whatever they might have. I find that that's generally a lagging indicator. And so I think all of us are probably talking about how frequently do you do the engagement score, engagement survey, do you do pulse surveys, what does that look like, is it weekly, is it after every meeting, blah, 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 blah. So I think it really depends, but engagement scores tend to be a bit of a lagging indicator when they're done every 6 months, but that's what we use right now, and we're thinking of new and interesting ways to change that, and we're supplementing with pulse surveys on the quarter.
Ernest, it looked like you wanted to.
Yeah, no, I think the way that you've defined culture is, as a behavioral psychologist, that's my background, it's like perfectly the right academic definition in terms of the processes, the values, the behaviors, all of those things. We define our culture the same way. And the way that we measure it is actually we use technology to manifest those things into reality, into tangible artifacts that people can interact with. And with that, then you get more data in terms of how people are interacting with your culture, so that you don't actually have to do as many pulse surveys. You're actually using the technology, using passive ways to collect how people are interacting with your culture. And that's how we start to engage and measure the culture.
Yeah, so James, I think the reason why culture is on a lot of people's minds today is because of the massive transparency we all have to the reality in other organizations. So your culture isn't just the way you get along, it's actually your recruiting budget. Like how good you are as a place to be, as a place for great employees to want to go to, that's going to define your success of recruiting more than a recruiting budget per se, or more than an ad campaign, or more than how many search firm dollars you pay. It's like it's so much more than just a poster on the wall. I'll never forget sitting in Jeff Weiner's office very early in his tenure, and he goes, and I said, Jeff, we really need to start talking about the culture. He goes, you know, when you say that word, I want to throw up in my mouth. I'm like, why? He goes, because at Yahoo, the executives talked about the culture and they did the exact opposite. So my advice to you is that the goal is not a poster on the wall. The goal is, and if you don't believe in culture, please don't put the effort into trying to articulate what a culture is. Because if you're going to do what you're going to do and it's different what you said, you're worse off than if you'd never talked about it.
That's exactly right.
We had to get serious about culture, not because we got smart about it, and Stanford actually built a case study on what we did, but because we had to. It was the only asset we had. I couldn't pay people more, right? We had to say, we're only going to win the war for recruiting if we become the place the best people want to be, because the hunting just wasn't paying off. But we hear about culture a lot because people can go to Glassdoor comparably and see all these notions about it. So if you invest and you see your employee as your public relations department, the experience you give them is your PR, then I think it sort of flips it a little bit. It's not just, oh, it's the thing that we have to, have a poster on the wall.
Yeah, we did an interesting thing. We do an annual values jam. So, when I joined, the company was in a really toxic culture environment, right? I mean, there was a riff a year before, and then the way they would riff people is they would take the people that aren't going to get riffed out to lunch, and then get rid of the people who were still in the office. And it was just like, I heard these stories, and I kind of flipped it. And when I joined, I said, look, I'm the new guy here, right? This is your company. Let's sit down and you guys build the culture that you guys want to build, and we'll sit there, together as a team. And I said, look, this is not going to be a laundry list of 50 things we're going to go do, but what are the 3 to 5 things that we're going to operate on how we treat each other, how we treat our investors' capital, and how we make decisions to make this business successful. And again, we have 4 basic pillars that we operate on. And now that conversation shifts from a top-down culture push to, hey, these are a set of folks who have worked together a lot longer than I've been there. You guys define the culture. And I tell you what, everybody gets excited for Values Jam. Because every year we said, hey, look, let's evaluate what we did the last year. Do these values still make sense? Do we need to add? Do we need to take some out? And we've changed them 3 times. It's a living document.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with what you're saying. And all the organizations I'm talking to today and the leaders I'm talking to today, what resonates for people today is they want to join somewhere where they have an ability to put their fingerprints on the culture, not to have to study what the tablets say, right? And I think people want to help grow something. If tenure keeps coming down, and every place I've been in the last 2 years, I ask leaders, are people staying in your company longer today than were last year? Nope, nobody. People are staying less. So it stands to reason that there's going to be a much more organic evolution of culture, right? And you've got to make it open. I know that feels awkward, like, no, we have to define exactly what the culture is. Well, when I was talking to Julia Hartz a few weeks ago, she's like, I want a culture that's always going to be moving and fluid, and it's going to adapt to the market conditions so that we can be successful, right? And it's not asynchronous with business success, I don't think. It's integral.
So, and I know these guys have metrics. My metric was, I reduced everybody's comp by 10% when I first joined. Nobody left. So that kind of, I think they were excited about building something and doing something for the future. We had 0 turnover on a reduction in salary. So think about that.
So on that, do the audience have questions? We do. Is there a microphone? There is in the opposite corner. Just say your name, your organization, and your question.
Hi, my name is Martin. I run a small consulting business. We help companies like yours with security compliance. But that's irrelevant. I have a question for you, Mihir. You mentioned that a year before you joined, half the company was invited over for lunch and the rest was kind of like asked to leave. I was in a situation like that too. I was lucky enough to be part of the lunch team. But how do you deal with a situation like that when you actually have to fire half the company and reduce, I'm just curious what you would have done in that situation.
So we didn't do a reduction in, so again, I wasn't there when that happened. This was a story that was told to me. When we did our first riff a year in, they had known what was happening with the business, right? I said, hey, profitability's not there, profitability's not there, profitability's not there. And I was actually in Southern California, and got on the phone with the investors and our CFO saying, hey, look, we're going to have to do something. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there in person, but I got everybody in the conference room. I said, hey, patch me in through a phone call. I said, look, it's going to be a tough day. Here's what we're going to go do. Your managers will be in touch. And again, this shouldn't be a surprise to you. But this kind of goes back to that. You've got it every week, Transparent Tuesdays. What's good, what's bad, what's working, what's not working. It's 15 minutes, right? And I think people feel engaged at that point. So I think just articulating what's going on with the business is super important. Just to the whole base, right? And the toughest part about it, I think, were the remote employees. We had folks out in the UK and that area that we had to let go. So obviously they're at a phone call at midnight, finding out that they're not going to have a job the next day. But I think again, being transparent from the beginning eliminates a lot of these things. And I kid you, a lot of people said, "I saw that coming," so it wasn't a surprise. The worst case is dropping a bomb on somebody, and they're like, "Whoa, I thought we were doing great. I thought we had this. I thought revenues were growing. I thought." So that's kind of my one takeaway is get it on the calendar once a day, once a week, once every 2 weeks, and just be open about the business. Don't be afraid to share your revenue numbers. Don't be afraid to go do those things.
Another question. No brave souls.
There we go.
Oh, no, there's one.
Hi, my name is Fatty Arbuckle. I help build a small startup called Foxtrot Systems. I guess I'm curious at what point we should really think about bringing on somebody to kind of handle HR. Right now it's just a partnership between myself and the founders, basically taking on the roles as needed. At what point do we really think about bringing on someone to sponsor that?
I'll give that one to Dawn, and then we'll close. I have one last question for the whole panel.
Sure, I'm actually really passionate about this, so I'm really glad that you asked the question. But my answer is it depends. It depends on with what level of intentionality you want to build your culture and with what level of investment you want to make. People usually don't hire me until you're about 200 people, right? But there's lots of great people that can do amazing contract work for you. You can get someone that's maybe a more mid-level person. But if you want to trust your HR and your culture with much respect to the person that is also your office manager and has never ever done it before, you're going to get a very different end game than if you invest early. I think one of the reasons that Slack has been as successful as we've been around culture is we invested early. We have a CEO who truly, truly believes in the people, and I was the first HR person, but it was at about 200 people, which is a little bit early, and it's allowed me the runway to build things that then can be repeatable and scalable and not have to kind of go back and clean up some of that people debt like you have technical debt.
I think habits are difficult to break, and so those early habits that you establish, whether it's the behaviors or things like that, are hard to break especially as you're scaling. And so, like you said, it really depends what you want for your company and the values that you want your company to espouse in terms of when you bring on the HR type people.
So I want to end on a high note, and you guys see the time. So going down, starting with Dawn and ending with Steve, what is the single most positively impactful thing that you think the audience can take away from this and go implement in their companies tomorrow?
Nothing like going first for the single most impactful. I would say make intentionality. Be intentional with what you're building, because if you're not intentional, it will build itself.
Transparent Tuesdays.
I would have to second the intentionality. Just be purposeful in the things that you do and the company that you're building.
Yeah, I think we're in as uncertain a period of employment as we've ever seen in our lifetime. The more you can invest in building trust, being credible, being authentic. We've got some kind of authenticity deficit going on in this country right now. The more you can do that, the more I think you're going to be able to draw on that. And that means, I think, I'll say I love the Transparent Tuesday, but I call it develop a listening strategy. Develop ways of checking in with people informally, not always in the office, not always in a conference room. We had a survey every year on our leadership team. Does your manager inspire you? And on our executive staff, all the scores were always good, but our CEO, Jeff, always got the lowest scores, and it was driving him crazy. Like insane. I go, Jeff, you inspire me. Your score is like, on a scale of 5, you're like 4.2. He goes, yeah, but it's the lowest on the team. I got to do something about that. And I said, okay, Jeff, let's talk about it. In your office every day, when people come in, what are you usually talking about? Oh, something that's broken, something that's wrong. So how do you think people feel when they come in your office? Do you think something's good's going to happen or something, a little confrontational? Confrontational, right. I didn't have to say anything else. He never had a one-on-one meeting in his office after that. And he finally got his scores back to where he wanted them to be. But that investment of trust today, super important in an uncertain world.
Panel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.